The winter of 1897 brought with it more than bitter cold to the Ozark Highlands. For men ventured deep into those ancient ridges, armed and determined, believing they hunted mere beasts. They sought a bear, perhaps, or a mountain lion grown too bold. What they discovered in those frozen hollows defied every natural law they understood. The creatures that stalked them through the cedars and limestone bluffs possessed an intelligence that chilled the blood more thoroughly than any January wind. Before this account proceeds further, I must ask you, dear reader, to mark this tale well and share where you find yourself as you read these words. The events described herein occurred in the remote backcountry near the current river, in a time when the wilderness still held dominion over vast stretches of the Ozark Plateau. We departed at first light on the 7th of January, for souls bound together by necessity and a shared determination to end the killings that had plagued the settlements. The frost lay thick upon every surface, transforming the dead leaves beneath our boots into a carpet that crackled and announced our passage with every step. The oaks stood skeletal against the pale sky, their branches bare and reaching, whilst the cedars alone maintained their verdant dignity upon the slopes, dark sentinels in a colorless landscape. Thomas Barrett led our party, a man of perhaps 45 years, weathered by decades in these hills. His Springfield rifle, an old friend from the war, rested upon his shoulder with the ease of long familiarity, whilst a short-handled axe hung at his belt. His face, lined and thoughtful, rarely betrayed emotion, yet his eyes missed nothing. He possessed the quiet authority of a man who had faced death before and found it wanting. Behind him walked Jonah Pike, our tracker and houndsman. At 32, Jonah stood as the finest reader of sign in 3 counties. He kept our 2 hounds, Duke and Bell, close on their leather leads, his attention fixed more upon the ground than the path ahead. The dogs, ordinarily eager for the hunt, seemed subdued that morning, their usual enthusiasm dampened by something they sensed but could not articulate. Jonah noticed this immediately, though he said nothing. He was not a man given to unnecessary words. Calvin Turner managed our pack mule, a sturdy beast loaded with provisions, salt pork wrapped in oilcloth, stone-ground cornmeal in canvas sacks, and sufficient powder and shot for an extended hunt. Cal, barely 23, tried valiantly to mask his nervousness, but the tightness around his eyes and the frequency with which he checked the loads betrayed his unease. This was his first true hunt of something dangerous, and the stories from town had clearly unsettled him more than he wished to admit. I brought up the rear, carrying my Henry rifle and a coil of good hemp rope. At 38, I had hunted these hills since boyhood, tracking deer and bear, occasionally a mountain lion when one grew too bold around the settlements. Yet something about this expedition felt different from the outset. The silence in the woods seemed too profound, too expectant, as though the very forest held its breath. We had come into the current river country following a series of livestock killings that had grown increasingly audacious. It began with chickens, then escalated to a calf behind the choke place, torn apart with such violence that even hardened farmers had blanched at the sight. Most recently, a prize sow belonging to the Linder family had been dragged from her pen in the dead of night, her death accompanied by sounds that had terrified those who heard them. The townspeople, gathered in the general store and the meeting house, had debated the culprit endlessly. Most favored a large cat, perhaps a panther driven down from the northern ranges by hunger. Others suggested a bear, though bears should have been denayed up for winter. Old Samuel Richardson, who operated the grist mill, had shared a tale that silenced the speculation. He claimed that 3 nights prior, while sitting by his fire, he had glimpsed something watching him from the ridge line above his cabin, something with horns that caught the moonlight. When pressed for details, he would only say that no natural creature moved as it did, and that he would not venture out after dark until the thing was dead or gone. No one had laughed at Samuel. The killings had created a palpable fear that kept families behind bolted doors once the sun set. With winter pressing down and meat scarce, something had to be done. Thus, we 4 had been commissioned to track whatever stalked the hills and end its predation, we followed an old trace that wound through the rough country, a path carved by hunters and trappers over decades, perhaps centuries. The route crossed numerous small draws and skirted the high side of a deep hollow where the ground fell away into darkness. This was limestone country, riddled with sinkholes that opened without warning, where thin streams disappeared into the earth only to emerge miles away. The terrain demanded constant vigilance. Thin sheets of ice clung to the edges of the creek where the current slowed, whilst the center ran clear and cold, carrying the taste of stone and deep earth. A hawk appeared overhead, circling once with lazy grace before drifting eastward, following thermals we could not feel. The last tendrils of smoke from the outlying farms faded behind us by mid-morning, and we entered true wilderness. The hounds had initially pulled against their leads with the characteristic enthusiasm of working dogs, but as we climbed higher into the hills, they grew increasingly subdued. Duke, normally the more vocal of the pair, fell silent entirely. Belle kept her nose low to the ground, occasionally pausing to sample scents with a care that spoke of wariness rather than eagerness. Near where the trace widened into a small clearing, Jonah suddenly crouched, his hand raised to halt our column. He had found something. With careful fingers, he lifted strands of coarse hair caught upon a broken stump. The fur was dark, almost black, and unusually rough in texture. It clung to the weathered wood as though scraped from a heavy body passing too close in the darkness. Jonah held the hair up to the light, examining it with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a suspect gem. The strands were thicker than deer hair, coarser than bear, and possessed an odd texture that seemed somehow wrong. He passed the sample to Tom without comment. Tom rolled the hair between his fingers, brought it to his nose, then frowned deeply. The scent, whatever it was, clearly troubled him. He handed it back to Jonah, who tucked it carefully into his pocket, evidence of something, though none of us could yet say what. We pressed onward through the morning, the silence broken only by the crunch of frost beneath our boots and the occasional call of a distant crow. The sun, when it appeared through gaps in the clouds, offered light but precious little warmth. Our breath hung before us in small clouds that dissipated slowly in the still air. Near midday, with the sun struggling to reach its zenith through the overcast sky, Jonah discovered the first kill site. A domestic goat lay half-concealed beneath a tangle of brush, approximately 100 yards off the main trace. The animal had clearly been dragged from someone's yard or pen. A length of frayed rope still encircled its neck, attached to a splintered cedar stake that had been torn from the ground. The manner of death was both brutal and peculiar. The goat's head had been torn nearly free, the neck vertebrae exposed by the violence of the attack. The rib cage lay open where the hide had been peeled back with what appeared to be deliberate care, almost surgical in its precision. Deep claw marks scored the shoulders, whilst puncture wounds through the spine suggested tremendous bite force. Yet what struck me most forcefully was the absence of feeding typical to predator kills. A bear would have fed extensively on the carcass. A mountain lion would have cached the remains for later consumption. This creature had killed, dragged its prey miles from human habitation, and then largely abandoned it. The killing seemed almost an act of sport or territory marking rather than necessity. Jonah led the hounds in a wide circle around the kill, keeping them carefully controlled. Duke and Belle showed none of their usual excitement at the scent of blood and death. Instead, their bodies trembled beneath their fur, muscles taut with an emotion that looked remarkably like dread. They did not bark or strain at their leads. They simply obeyed, their usual independence replaced by a desperate desire to stay close to Jonah's legs. Approximately 20 paces from the carcass, Jonah halted and gestured urgently for us to join him. There, pressed into the softer earth between stones, we found our first clear prints. They measured large and heavy, broader than any cat track I had encountered. The general shape suggested feline origin, for distinct pads with clear claw marks extending beyond them. Yet mountain lions retract their claws whilst walking, leaving prints without such prominent marks. These claws had dug deep furrows in the earth, as though the creature walked with its talons permanently extended. The stride length between prints was remarkable, suggesting an animal capable of covering ground with frightening efficiency. Tom knelt beside one particularly clear impression, removing his hat to better study the track. He ran his thumb along the edge, measuring its depth and width, his expression growing increasingly grave. When he rose and replaced his hat, he offered no comment, but his silence spoke volumes. We established our first camp on a bench of land above the creek, where the wind broke against a natural wall of striated limestone. The spot offered good visibility of our approaches whilst providing some shelter from the bitter wind that had begun to rise with the afternoon. We gathered deadfall, hickory and oak, both of which burn hot and clean, and constructed a small fire, keeping the flames deliberately low. No sense advertising our presence more than necessary. The mule, picketed nearby, cropped at what sparse grass she could find beneath the frost, whilst the hounds curled close to the fire's warmth, their noses buried in their paws. Cal sliced bacon into our iron skillet, turning the pieces with a peeled branch, his movements mechanical and his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When he asked, with forced lightness, whether we truly thought a bear was responsible, the question hung unanswered in the cold air. None of us wished to voice our growing suspicions. After our sparse meal, Tom withdrew a small leather-bound notebook from his coat and studied a hand-drawn map of the surrounding hollows and ridges. His finger traced a route toward a location he had marked as Duck Blind Springs. According to information gathered in town, strange sounds have been reported emanating from that direction for the past fortnight. Always after dark, always unsettling to those who heard them. Tom closed the book and secured it in his pocket without sharing whatever conclusions he had drawn. I cleaned my Henry rifle with meticulous care, checking the lever action by feel, ensuring no frost or moisture had compromised its mechanism. In country such as this, one's weapon represented the thin line between survival and catastrophe. I had no intention of discovering a malfunction at a critical moment. As the sun descended behind the western ridges, the temperature plummeted with startling rapidity. Our breath transformed into thick clouds that hung before our faces. The woods, which had maintained a background murmur of small sounds throughout the day, fell into an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to still, as though nature itself waited for something. We heard the first cry when the moon cleared the eastern ridge, its pale light transforming the frost-covered landscape into something ethereal and strange. The sound began low, a rumbling note that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It rose steadily in pitch, climbing the scale until it reached an almost human register, before breaking into a rough, truncated laugh that raised every hair on my body. The laugh transitioned into a prolonged, trumpet-like call that swelled and fell, echoing through the hollows and bouncing off the limestone bluffs until its origin became impossible to determine. Duke and Bell surged to their feet, their bodies rigid, every muscle taut as iron. They leaned hard against their leads, not with the eager pull of hounds on a scent, but with the desperate tension of creatures confronting something that violated every instinct. Jonah held them down with both hands, his voice low and soothing, though his own face had gone pale in the firelight. The cry came again, distinctly closer this time, the sound cascading through the darkness with an almost physical presence. It bounced and echoed against the stone wall surrounding our camp until I found myself unable to determine its direction with any certainty. The sound carried notes of a mountain lion's scream, mixed with something deeper, more resonant, that reminded me of an elk's bugle. Yet it matched neither precisely, existing in some uncomfortable middle ground that suggested nothing I had ever encountered in decades of hunting these hills. I felt a primal response course through my body, that ancient warning system that exists in all creatures, the voice that screams of danger even when the conscious mind cannot yet articulate the threat. The hair on my forearms stood rigid beneath my shirt sleeves. My heart hammered against my ribs with uncomfortable force. Cal's eyes found Tom's face, searching for reassurance or perhaps permission to voice his fear. Tom's expression remained carefully neutral, though I saw his jaw muscles tighten fractionally. He fed 2 small sticks to our fire and stated calmly that we would maintain a low flame throughout the night. His tone brooked no argument and offered no explanation, though none was needed. We all understood that whatever stalked these ridges, we did not wish to draw its full attention. None of us managed more than brief snatches of sleep that night. We sat with our backs to the fire, facing outward into the darkness, each man holding his weapon ready. The cry echoed twice more as dawn approached, then ceased entirely, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow more ominous than the sound itself. When first light finally painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and pale rose, we found the mule's back silvered with frost. We stamped our feet to restore circulation and set out toward Duck-Blind Springs without discussion. The night had settled something amongst us, a shared understanding that we would see this through to whatever end awaited. The terrain surrounding Duck-Blind Springs was particularly treacherous, broken into shelves of limestone with thin soil precariously held between them. Cedar roots gripped the rock edges with gnarled tenacity, creating natural handholds for our careful progress. We moved in single file along a narrow game path, each man watching his footing while simultaneously scanning the surrounding forest. Jonah bent to examine something in the path and retrieved what appeared to be a pellet of scat. He broke it apart with a stick, revealing fragments of bone and hair compressed within. The hair bore no resemblance to deer fur, and the bone fragments showed evidence of crushing force far beyond what any normal predator would employ. He dropped the remains and wiped his fingers in the dirt with visible distaste. A stench hung in the air of a small basin ahead, heavy and sour, like old meat left too long in warm weather. The smell intensified as we climbed, growing thick enough to taste at the back of one's throat. A large cedar stood scarred where something had raked its claws high upon the trunk. The marks sat above my head by a considerable margin. I estimated at least 7 feet from the ground, perhaps more, for parallel gouges cut deep into the wood, the bark torn away to reveal pale flesh beneath. Jonah's jaw worked silently as he studied the marks. He noted that a bear might achieve such height if it stood on its hind legs, but his tone carried no conviction. Tom nodded agreement, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. We had all observed bear damage on trees before. These marks were different in ways none of us could quite articulate. The hounds began a low whine that seemed to emanate from their chests rather than their throats, a sound of pure distress that I had never heard from working dogs. Their tails tucked hard between their legs, and they pressed against Jonah's shins with desperation. Before midday, we discovered the second kill, and this one was fresh. Steam still rose from the torn belly of a yearling deer. The violence of the death shocked even men accustomed to the brutal efficiency of natural predation. The deer's legs had been snapped like kindling and flung apart. Its head bore clear signs of having been crushed by tremendous force, the skull fractured and compressed. Blood pooled darkly in the frozen grass, not yet congealed. The prints surrounding the kill site showed a disturbing pattern. The creature had apparently circled its prey multiple times, the tracks suggesting it had moved in a rough circumference, almost as though performing some ritual before the final kill. Within this circle, I counted 3 distinct places where hoofed marks had struck stone, creating small chips. These were not deer hooves. The impressions were shorter, sharper, positioned at the front of the main pad in a configuration I had never encountered. Tom crouched beside one particularly clear print, holding his hand above it without actually touching the impression, as though physical contact might somehow contaminate whatever information it contained. When he stood, his decision was swift and sure. We would not track directly from a fresh kill. Instead, we would circle wide, cross the ridge, and approach from downwind. This was sound hunting practice when dealing with any dangerous predator. But Tom's urgency suggested he considered our quarry far more formidable than a simple bear or cat. Jonah led the dogs away from the kill site, though they required no encouragement to depart. Cal continued to stare at the crushed head of the deer, then at the shadows between the cedars, his imagination clearly filling those dark spaces with horrors. I felt sympathy for the young man. This was far beyond anything his limited experience had prepared him for, and we crested the ridge on our hands and knees in places, scrambling over loose rock and scree that threatened to send us sliding backward with every step. The wind struck our faces from the north, carrying the clean scent of distance and high places, temporarily clearing our nostrils of the death stench that had followed us all morning. My legs burned with the exertion, muscles protesting the steep grade. From the ridge crest, the land fell away into a long hollow choked with scrub oak and scattered glades of frost-covered grass. Duck-blind springs sat near the bottom, beneath a line of rock where water seeped constantly from the limestone, even in winter. A thin mist hung over the seepage area, creating an ethereal curtain that obscured details. The hounds pulled harder now, but their behavior had transformed. This was no longer the eager pull of hunting dogs on a scent. Their movements spoke of profound reluctance, of every instinct screaming at them to flee. Jonah's arms tightened to maintain control, and despite the bitter cold, sweat appeared on his neck and temples. He glanced back once, and I saw him weighing the decision to release the dogs, to let them run and save themselves. He kept them close. We descended the slope at an angle, moving with extreme care. The stench hit us again, stronger than before, settling into the hollow like a physical presence. The hair along the dog backs stood rigid, and they both halted simultaneously, their bodies trembling as they set their legs and refused to advance another step. Tom raised his hand, and our column froze instantly. We stood beneath a limestone bluff that offered a vantage point over the flat ground below. The spring water cut through the grass in a clear rivulet, running over smooth stones worn by centuries of flow. On the far side, beneath a low-growing cedar, something dark rested in the grass. It was not a kill. It was a bed, a clear depression where something large had lain repeatedly. The grass was pressed flat in an oval perhaps 6 feet long. Coarse dark hair lay scattered across the compressed vegetation. The ground bore prints that showed this site had been used multiple times, the earth churned deep by repeated occupation. The prints displayed that same troubling characteristic, hoof-like impressions positioned just ahead of the main pads. Most unsettling was the bed's orientation. It faced uphill, directly toward the route we had descended. Whatever made this lair habitually face the approach we had just used. It watched that path. It expected threats from that direction. Tom swallowed hard and brought his Springfield to his shoulder without fully bringing it to his cheek. He held the weapon ready, whilst his mind worked through our limited options. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. We would not attempt to cross the flat ground. We would retreat carefully and climb to the next ridge to maintain superior sight lines. His tactical sense remained sound even in the face of mounting dread. Cal's breathing had grown rapid and shallow, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled panic. He nodded too many times, unable to articulate words, and his face had lost all color. We had taken perhaps 3 careful steps backward when a stone rolled loose somewhere above us. The sound of it clicking down the slope, then breaking apart on a larger rock, froze us all mid-step. Every head rotated upward in unison. The hillside appeared empty, unchanging. Nothing moved amongst the cedars and oaks. I checked my rifle's chamber by touch alone, not trusting myself to look away from the slope above. The mule, sensing our tension, shifted nervously and bumped my shoulder with her pack frame. Behind me, I heard Jonah's whispered command telling the dogs to lie down. They obeyed immediately, pressing their bodies against the cold ground, though they did not relax. Their eyes remained fixed up slope, unblinking. Another stone dislodged, this time from closer, perhaps 40 feet above where the game path angled down. This stone did not fall through simple erosion or thermal expansion. It bounced deliberately, paused as though checked mid-tumble, then skittered again before coming to rest. Something had pushed it. Something was testing us. Tom's hand rose higher, commanding absolute stillness. The wind continued to blow into our faces, carrying our scent away from whatever watched us. The stench in the hollow deepened until I could taste it, thick and rancid at the back of my throat. A shadow detached itself from a clump of brush and moved across the slope with 3 slow, deliberate steps. My breath caught in my chest. The creature was broad across the shoulders and carried itself low in front, with its hindquarters notably higher, the build of something designed for tremendous forward thrust and power. 2 horns rose from its skull in tight curves, catching what little light penetrated the overcast sky. The head turned, and eyes like burning coals fixed upon our position. They reflected red in the dim light, unblinking, intelligent. The creature held absolutely still for a long moment, long enough for me to observe its form in terrible detail, before it slipped behind a cedar trunk with unnatural fluidity. No sound accompanied its movement. The only sounds in that hollow were the eternal murmur of the spring and our own shallow, frightened breathing. Tom's hand lowered slowly, and he spoke without moving his lips more than necessary. We could not hope for a clean shot through the brush at this distance. We would retreat in a straight line to the ridge behind us, then circle east to more open ground where our rifles would have clear lanes. His voice remained remarkably calm, betraying none of the fear I knew he must feel. He looked at each of us in turn, ensuring we understood. We nodded our acknowledgement. We began our retreat, one careful step at a time, placing our feet with excruciating precision on the treacherous ground. The dogs would not walk. Jonah was forced to lift them bodily, their front legs dangling uselessly, and physically relocate them for each step. Their control had utterly broken. We reached the angle of the bluff and slipped behind it one by one, temporarily breaking line of sight with whatever stalked the slope. The moment we achieved this small measure of cover, both dogs barked twice sharp, panicked sounds that tore through the hollow and echoed off the stone walls with startling volume. The creature's response came immediately, that same rising howl we had heard in the night, beginning low and climbing to a rough, broken burst before ending in a prolonged call that physically shook the leaves on the branches above our heads. The sound contained rage and challenge in equal measure. My hands went numb despite my gloves, all blood seeming to drain from my extremities. Tom spoke a single word, "Go." We moved. Tom maintained our discipline even in retreat, keeping us in a tight formation and checking our spacing with quick glances over his shoulder. We moved at a fast walk rather than a run. On this broken ground, speed meant a twisted ankle or worse, and an injured man would doom us all. The hounds pulled frantically, torn between the desperate urge to flee and an equally powerful instinct to freeze and hide. Jonah managed them with short, practiced movements, his own fear locked down behind years of discipline. Cal pulled the mule's lead with white-knuckled hands, his breathing harsh through his mouth. He whispered urgently that we should angle south, put the creek between ourselves and the slope. Tom's response was immediate and final. No. We would reach the ridge, maintain the high ground, and keep the wind in our faces. His tone left no room for argument. I felt my own legs wanting to run, my body screaming at me to sprint for safety. I forced the impulse down through sheer will. Moving fast on this terrain would be suicide. I wanted solid footing and clear sight lines more than I wanted speed. Fear was sharpening my mind rather than clouding it. Halfway up the slope, we heard stones clattering to our right. Above the hollow we had just departed. The sound came in 2 distinct bursts separated by a brief pause. Not the random slide of erosion, but deliberate displacement, like a boot scraping deliberately against rock. Then another similar burst. Cal stopped dead. Tom waved him forward without words, his face grim. The dogs took their cue from his gesture and moved again, though their reluctance was palpable. I kept my eyes trained high, searching for movement between the tree trunks. A stand of young cedars concealed the slope above Duck Blind Springs. Nothing emerged from that green wall. Nothing revealed itself. When we finally reached the ridgetop, the wind struck us with renewed force, colder than before, and blessedly pushed the terrible stench away. I felt my head clear somewhat, my thoughts becoming more coherent. Tom immediately pointed east toward a long spine of exposed rock that extended into a natural glade. He explained that we would cross to that defensible position, then descend to more open ground. The glade would provide clear sight lines in all directions. We started across the ridgetop, moving through thinning trees. Patches of brown grass grew between flat stones, smoothed by countless seasons of weather. The glade opened ahead, its center marked by a blackened circle where someone had once constructed a charcoal mound. A ring of fire-cracked stones still stood around the scorched earth. Tom's fist rose abruptly, halting our column. On the near edge of that stone ring, fresh scratches marred the lichen covering 3 large rocks. Each mark consisted of 2 parallel gouges set close together, point to point, with a third, deeper nick between them. The pattern repeated on each marked stone. Jonah crouched beside one set of marks and touched it with a fingertip. He said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. I studied the spacing and depth of the scratches, my mind automatically comparing them to the tracks we had found earlier. The distance between marks matched the width of those mysterious prints with unsettling precision. Cal's voice broke the silence, asking where the nearest farm lay from our current position. Tom replied that the choke place sat to the north, perhaps 2 ridges distant. The scratches faced that direction. He stared at them longer than seemed necessary, and I understood what troubled him. These marks might be territorial markers, warnings to other creatures, or they might indicate the direction of the creature's next hunt. Either possibility was deeply unsettling. We continued through the glade. The dogs, which had begun to show slight improvement in their temperament, suddenly threw their weight backward with such force that Jonah nearly lost his grip on their leads. They dropped to their bellies in unison, their heads turning not toward duck-blind springs behind us, but up the ridge from which we had just descended. Jonah gave them enough lead to stand, though they clearly had no desire to move. They simply stared at a particular patch of brush near a large boulder, their bodies rigid, waiting for something to emerge. I trained my Henry on the gap between 2 oak trunks and forced my breathing to steady. Tom's voice came low and controlled. He stated that we would not remain exposed in the open glade. We would reach the high rock spine, establish a small fire for smoke, and wait until mid-afternoon to make our decision about camp. Cal muttered that he would not sleep anywhere near this cursed ground. Tom ignored the comment and pointed toward our destination. We went, moving with renewed purpose, from atop the rock spine. The country fell away in a series of natural terraces. Duck-blind springs lay behind us now, hidden by intervening ridges. To the east, the land opened in a scattered oak forest interspersed with frost-silvered grass. A narrow game trail cut across the near slope, following the path animals used when traveling toward water sources. The wind maintained its steady flow from the north, gradually diminishing the pervasive stench until it existed only at the very edge of perception. I found I could think more clearly without that constant olfactory assault on my senses. Tom instructed us to build a small fire behind a natural break in the rock formation, not for warmth, but to test the air currents. We needed to know whether smoke would rise straight or shift with unexpected changes in wind direction. The smoke rose perfectly vertical. Good. That meant the wind remained consistent, which meant our scent would continue to blow away from whatever stalked these ridges. We ate cold biscuits and thin slices of bacon, a sparse meal that did little to combat the cold but provided necessary fuel. The mule stood with her ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on something none of us could see, and refused to graze despite the availability of suitable forage. Jonah poured a small amount of water into a tin cup for the dogs. They lapped briefly, then lifted their heads to sample the air. They showed no interest in food. In working dogs, such behavior indicated profound unease. Tom outlined his tactical plan with the methodical precision of a man who had commanded troops in combat. We would hold this high ground until the sun began its descent toward the western ridges. If the creature remained on our side of the divide, we would relocate east to establish a night camp on open slope with clear fields of fire in all directions. If it dropped back behind us and returned to the vicinity of the springs, we would withdraw to the creek and follow it south until full darkness, then construct a hasty lean-to and maintain watches throughout the night. He made his intentions perfectly clear. He did not intend to track this thing into its lair. He wanted it to move through terrain where it would be forced to expose itself. This was sound tactical thinking, the wisdom of a man who understood that rushing blindly after dangerous prey in unknown terrain was a recipe for disaster. Jonah voiced his agreement. Cal absorbed the plan and nodded, attempting to project confidence he clearly did not feel. To his credit, he maintained his composure better than many men would have done under such circumstances. For the next hour, the woods maintained an oppressive quiet. A blue jay called once from the lower oaks to our left, its harsh voice seeming unnaturally loud in the silence. A gray squirrel darted across a fallen log and vanished into a cavity, its bushy tail the last thing to disappear. These small signs of normal life provided some measure of comfort. I worked oil into a stiff section of my rifle's lever action, using a soft cloth and careful movements. My eyes never left the game trail below for more than a few seconds at a time. Tom tested his rifle's sights against identifiable targets, a section of dead snag at 50 paces, then again at 100. He made minute adjustments to his position, ensuring his aim would be true when the moment came. Jonah sat with his eyes half closed, head tilted in the characteristic posture of men who have spent years listening to forests. He was sorting sounds, separating near from far, natural from unnatural. The hounds rested with their chests pressed against the cold stone, mouths closed, ears swiveling constantly to catch any sound. The mule managed 3 mouthfuls of grass before abandoning the effort, standing instead with her head held high, nostrils flaring. The sound, when it came, originated from the north ridge, not from the springs area. It was not the chilling cry we had heard in the night. Instead, we heard a low huff followed by a sharp stamp, then the distinct scrape of something heavy being dragged across stone. The pattern repeated at irregular intervals. I counted the spaces between each repetition, searching for rhythm, finding none. Whatever made these sounds was not following the natural patterns of any animal I knew. Tom gestured for our attention and pointed toward a stand of blackjack oak below the northern ridge crest, where the ground folded into a shallow depression. If our stalker approached through that terrain, it would necessarily expose itself against lighter-colored grass. He settled his Springfield's muzzle across the stone and positioned his shoulder, taking his time to establish a proper firing position. I joined him at a different angle, creating a crossfire that would give us overlapping lanes of engagement. Jonah brought the dogs behind our firing line and secured their leads to a sturdy cedar root, ensuring they could not bolt but retaining enough slack that they wouldn't strangle themselves if panic set in. He then took his position with his shotgun loaded with heavy buckshot. Cal crouched with the mule's lead wrapped around his wrist, keeping the animal clear of our firing lanes. We waited, our breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The sun passed behind a thin band of cloud, reducing the already limited light. The scraping sound came again, definitely closer now, as though the creature had advanced 10 paces whilst we remained motionless. A disturbing thought took root in my mind. The thing was testing our position, reading our placement the way a human tactician might before committing to an assault. The notion that we faced something capable of such calculated behavior chilled me more thoroughly than the January wind. Tom's lips compressed into a thin line. I could see in his expression that he had reached the same conclusion. He whispered that we would not call or whistle, would not attempt to draw the creature's attention. We would allow it to choose its own avenue of approach, then hold our ground and trust in our weapons. This represented a significant shift from traditional hunting practice, where the hunter actively pursues his quarry. Tom was acknowledging, without quite stating it explicitly, that we were no longer purely the hunters. A stone dislodged then, small initially, but it struck a larger rock and broke apart with a sharp crack that echoed across the hollow. The sound came from a shallow depression Tom had identified, precisely where he had predicted. A shadow slipped between the blackjack trunks with fluid grace. The creature moved with its front quarters low and hindquarters elevated. I glimpsed the outline of its head and the curved sweep of its horns for perhaps 2 heartbeats. Its eyes caught the diminished daylight and held it, glowing like coals in a banked fire. My trigger finger took up the slack, the mechanism reaching the wall without breaking. Tom fired first. The crack of his Springfield struck hard and reverberated through the hills. My shot followed a fraction of a second later. Jonah's buckshot thundered after mine, and I saw a bark explode from a trunk near where the shadow had been. The shadow vanished. A breath later, the cry rose from the ridge directly behind our position, rolling down the slope with terrible volume. Not from a depression we had just fired into, but from entirely the opposite direction. The dogs slammed against their cedar root anchor with such violence I thought they might break their own necks. They barked in pure panic, all training forgotten. The mule reared vertically, forelegs pawing air. Cal lost his grip on the lead rope and dove desperately to reclaim it before the animal could bolt. He caught the rope on the second grab and wrapped it twice around his wrist, though the mule continued to dance and pull with frantic strength. I swung my rifle toward the rear ridge and scanned the trees with desperate intensity. Nothing showed itself amongst the trunks and shadows. Tom swore under his breath, the first time I had heard him curse during the entire expedition. He stated flatly that whatever we had fired at in the depression was not the source of the cry. Something had moved in that pocket, certainly, but the vocalization had originated from behind us. He did not explicitly say that we had been manipulated, but the realization was written clearly across his weathered face. One creature had drawn our attention and our fire, whilst another positioned itself at our backs. He told Jonah to maintain control of the dogs, and instructed me to cover the approach path up our own ridge. He told Cal to steady the mule and keep low. His hands reloaded his Springfield with slow, deliberate precision, each motion careful and controlled despite the adrenaline that must have been flooding his system. He kept searching for second shape, and I did the same. I despised the thought of facing 2 of these creatures simultaneously, but tactical reality demanded we consider the possibility now. The evidence was inescapable. The woods answered our violence with profound silence. No cry came. No stones rolled. Nothing moved. I waited for the next development, my hands steadier now than they had been minutes before. Fear had transmuted into something more useful, a sharp focus that narrowed my world to sight lines, firing solutions and distances. I traced likely approach routes in my mind, measured the ground from landmark to landmark, identified places where a body could advance whilst remaining concealed, and selected precisely where I would place my shots if only a shoulder or hip presented itself as a target. I set my foot firmly against a protruding root to anchor my stance. Tom nodded once, recognizing my preparations and making similar calculations of his own. The next development came not from the ridge, but from directly beneath our position. A breath of fetid air rose through a crack in the rock formation and struck our faces with that now familiar reek of rot and carrion. I had not previously noticed the fissure in the stone. It was narrow and dark, no wider than a man's boot in most places, yet it ran beneath the high point of our defensive spine and angled downslope into the brush below. The cry that had seemed to come from behind us had effectively masked sounds from below our very feet. We had been outmaneuvered with disturbing sophistication. I crouched and peered down along the crack's length. A droplet of dark liquid clung to the stone edge. It was decidedly not water. The consistency was thicker, more viscous. Jonah saw it and pulled one of the dogs closer. The animal's lips lifted in a sound I had never heard from any dog, a sort of whimpering growl that spoke of primal terror. Tom shifted 3 paces to his left, positioning himself to cover the lowest opening of the fissure where the rock formation broke apart into soil and brush. A small stone rattled inside the crack and came to rest. Then came a deliberate exhalation, not a cough, not a sneeze, but a purposeful release of breath. The red eyes appeared in the darkness for an instant, reflecting what little light penetrated the fissure, then vanished back into blackness. Tom's rifle was already positioned. He did not fire. He was waiting for a clear shot, one that would do more than merely wound. I brought my barrel down and found an angle that revealed the edge of what might have been a cheek and part curved horn. The target was insufficient. I could not guarantee a shot that would penetrate to vital organs. Jonah raised his shotgun, then lowered it again as he reached the same conclusion I had. Buckshot would simply spray against stone and potentially blind us with ricochets and rock fragments. We held our positions, fingers resting against triggers, breathing controlled. The exhalation came again, closer to the lower break in the rock. The fissure appeared to widen as stone shifted under tremendous pressure. I felt the change through my boots, a subtle vibration that spoke of immense strength being applied below. Whatever moved in that crack possessed sufficient power to flex solid limestone. It was working toward the lower exit point. Tom adjusted his position fractionally and set his front sight precisely at the opening. He spoke very softly, outlining our plan of engagement. When the creature exposed a shoulder, he would take the first shot. I would follow immediately, placing my round of hands behind his impact point into the same vital area. If it pushed entirely through the opening, Jonah would fire his buckshot at chest height. Cal was to pull the mule behind the cedar and keep his head down. The plan settled over us like a well-fitted coat. Everyone understood their role. The tip of a horn entered the opening, followed by part of the heavy brow ridge and an eye that flared red in the gloom. Flesh and bone followed as the creature began to force its bulk through the narrow gap. Tom's shot hit with a flat, meaty thud that I felt as much as heard. My shot touched the target a span behind his precisely as planned. The thing withdrew with shocking speed that seemed physically impossible for something of its size. Stone scraped against hide and bone. A low tone filled the fissure and ran along its length like air resonating in an organ pipe. I smelled hot metal from Tom's barrel and worked my lever action, chambering a fresh round. Jonah held his fire, refusing to waste his shot without a clear target. Blood began to run from the lower edge of the opening, pattering onto dead leaves below. It was dark, almost black, and possessed an unusual thickness. Notably, it did not steam in the cold air as fresh blood should. We listened intently. The sounds inside the rock moved away in short bursts, paused, resumed farther downslope, then ceased entirely. The oppressive stench eased slightly, suggesting the creature was withdrawing. Tom kept his rifle trained on the hole for a full minute, measured by the sun's position. Only when he felt certain did he turn his head and announce that we could not maintain this position any longer. We had wounded it, perhaps angered it, certainly revealed our position and capabilities. He chose open ground and a clear night fire, where we could establish 360-degree visibility and deny the creature any concealed approach routes. He instructed us to gather our equipment in complete silence. I agreed wholeheartedly with his tactical assessment. The rock spine had transformed from a defensive position into a potential trap. We were too exposed to attack from below, and the fissures clearly provided the creatures with concealed movement routes we could not adequately monitor. We departed the spine and moved into the oak forest, staying low, keeping the ridge to our backs until we could break eastward toward more open terrain. The dog walked without sound now, their fear having evolved into something approaching grim discipline. Cal's face had lost all color, gray as ash, and he kept his eyes fixed on the ground immediately before his feet. He did not speak, conserving his energy for movement. I felt a tightness in my chest, but also a clean sense of purpose. We knew more now than we had that morning. The creatures could move through underground passages. They could coordinate their movements, suggesting either high intelligence or pack behavior. They studied our positions and tested our responses. Most importantly, they bled. That final fact carried enormous weight. These were not supernatural apparitions or manifestations from folklore. They were flesh and bone that could be injured and, by extension, killed. This knowledge did not diminish the danger we faced. If anything, it emphasized the lethality of our situation. But it provided one clear path forward. Establish a position where sight lines were extensive and force the creatures to expose themselves or abandon their predation. We continued moving until the trees thinned into a long slope of grass interspersed with scattered rock outcroppings. The sun leaned westward, still providing sufficient light to read the terrain for a considerable distance. Tom selected a spot near a group of waist-high stones that formed a natural semicircle facing uphill. The formation offered some cover whilst not obstructing our view of potential approach routes. He issued instructions calmly and precisely. We would unpack our equipment, secure the mule with its back against the stone for protection, and tie the dogs where they could move but not bolt if panic overtook them. If darkness caught us unprepared, we would pay dearly for our lack of foresight. Jonah cleared a flat area for our fire with practiced efficiency, gathering dry grass for tinder, then progressively thicker branches, all accomplished with minimal noise. Cal established our sleeping areas behind the stones and checked the mule's pack loads twice, ensuring none of the tins or tools would rattle and betray our position. I laid out our ammunition on a clean cloth where hands could reach it without fumbling in darkness. Rifle cartridges here, shotgun shells there, pistol rounds if needed. The wind continued from the north, carrying no scent I could identify beyond pine and cold stone. The oppressive weight that had followed us since Duck-Blind Springs eased considerably in this more open location. The animals held steadier. The dogs lay with their heads up, alert but no longer trembling. I entertained the thought that perhaps these creatures preferred hollows and enclosed spaces, that open slopes held no appeal for them. The thought provided comfort for perhaps 5 seconds before I dismissed it as wishful thinking. Tom outlined our defensive arcs with clear hand gestures. He would cover the center, addressing the main approach up the slope. I would hold the right sector where the grass dipped into a shallow drainage. Jonah would take the left near the edge of a thin grove of young oaks. Cal would remain against the stones with the mule, serving as loader and supplying ammunition to whoever required it. No one voiced objections. The plan was sound, accounting for our strengths and limitations. The only unknown variable was the number of creatures. How many stalked these ridges? How close had we come to being completely encircled without realizing our peril? We ignited the fire once the sun touched the western ridge. We used only a small quantity of wood, enough for smoke and modest heat. The light spread across the grass and gave every rock a sharp, defined shadow. The sky transitioned from blue to a washed gray. Birds settled somewhere in the distant valleys. The hills seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Tom suggested we converse in low, steady tones to avoid jumping at every ambient noise. He asked Jonah for his professional assessment of the tracks we had observed. Jonah stated flatly that they matched no cat he had ever encountered, and a bear could not possibly move with the agility we had witnessed. Then he offered an observation that resonated deeply with me. He explained, tracked animals throughout his entire life. Every species possessed a distinctive rhythm. Deer flicked their ears in a characteristic pattern and stepped twice before committing their weight. Cats paused with their back foot suspended for a heartbeat before placing it. Bears swayed as they walked and tested ground with their noses before advancing. These creatures' rhythm was fundamentally wrong. They stopped too still, moved too suddenly, and watched before stepping rather than relying on scent or sound. That behavior indicated thought, planning. They were not simply responding to hunger or instinct. They were strategizing. Cal rubbed his hands together and stared into the fire. He asked again why we did not simply retreat to the farms and warn the residents. Tom's response was immediate and compelling. Whatever followed us might follow the families if we fled toward the valley. Better to finish the confrontation here, in terrain of our choosing, than to risk a dead calf becoming a dead child. Cal closed his mouth and nodded slowly. I saw fear in his eyes, certainly, but also something else, perhaps shame at having suggested abandonment of duty or determination not to be the man who failed his neighbors in their hour of need. Darkness crept up from the creek bottoms first, like water filling a vessel. The open slope retained light longer, holding the last rays of sunset. Our fire crackled once, startlingly loud in the profound quiet. I checked my rifle's chamber for perhaps the 100th time. Jonah steadied his shotgun across his knee, his eyes never ceasing their scan of the darkening perimeter. Tom barely blinked, his gaze fixed on the primary approach up the slope. His breathing remained slow and controlled, hands loose on his weapon. The first sound came from behind our position, a low scraping across stone, not distant. We rotated as one, rifles rising to shoulders, but saw only the silhouettes of cedar trunks against the marginally lighter sky. The scraping came again, farther to the right now. Jonah swore under his breath, his usual composure cracking slightly. Tom shifted his weight, his tactical mind working through the implications. The creatures had circled above us on the slope and were attempting to identify blind spots in our defensive position. The dogs rose to their feet and stared uphill with fixed intensity. They did not growl or bark, simply maintained that hard, unwavering stare that hunting dogs give to serious threats. Then the smell came through on the wind, faint initially, but unmistakable once recognized. The mule's head snapped around, and it brayed once before Cal's hand clamped over its muzzle, stifling further sound. The cry that followed cut through the darkness from our left, down near the shallow drainage I was supposed to be covering. It echoed, long and loud, spilling across the hollow like liquid horror. My heart leaped into my throat, hammering so hard I could feel it in my temples. The cry was not alone. A second call answered from farther up the ridge, higher in pitch, equally chilling. Two creatures. We had feared it. Now we possessed confirmation. Tom did not speak. The situation required no discussion. We tightened our defensive line, each man shifting slightly to ensure no gaps existed in our coverage. The fire between us and the protective stones cast long shadows across the open ground. I adjusted my position to keep the glare from interfering with my night vision. A shape moved near the boulders above us, broad and low in front, the characteristic build we had glimpsed before. The red eyes burned in the darkness like banked forge fires. It stepped slowly, deliberately, then paused to watch us. The pause lasted long enough for my heart to beat 5 times. I raised my rifle and found my sight picture, but I waited for Tom to initiate the engagement. He breathed once, deep and full, then fired. The muzzle flash lit the slope like lightning, destroying our night vision for crucial seconds. The shape jerked, not in pain, I thought, but in anger or surprise. It dropped behind a rock outcropping. Jonah fired his buckshot toward where it had stood. Stone chips flew, and the blast echoed back from the ridgeline. The second creature came from the drainage with terrifying speed, covering ground in great bounding strides that spoke of tremendous power. I fired and struck its flank. I saw hair and perhaps flesh fly from the impact point. It skidded sideways and crashed into a stump with force enough to shake the ground, but it did not fall. It regained its feet with its head lowered and horns catching firelight like polished obsidian. Cal shouted incoherently. The mule snapped its rope with a sharp crack and kicked backward, nearly trampling him as he dove aside. Jonah swung his barrels toward the charging creature. He waited with remarkable discipline until it cleared the brush that might deflect his pattern, then fired into its shoulder at perhaps 15 yards. The blast rolled up the ridge like thunder. The thing released a choking roar and twisted away, clearly hit hard. Blood sprang dark across the frost-silvered grass, black in the firelight. It fled uphill, dragging a rear leg that no longer functioned properly. Tom yelled for us to maintain coverage on the first creature. He fired another round toward the rock where it had taken cover. A growl rumbled from the shadows, deep and resonant, unlike any sound a natural animal should produce. Then the rock shifted. The creature actually shoved the stone aside. It must have weighed 200 pounds or more, and stepped into our firelight. The horns curved tight against its massive skull, polished and wickedly pointed. Its fur was thick and dark, matted with dirt and what appeared to be dry blood from previous kills. Its mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were long, uneven, and designed for rending flesh. It dragged one front paw as it advanced, suggesting Tom's first shot had struck bone, but the injury did not appear to slow it significantly. Jonah reloaded with hands that moved in a blur of practice motion. I aimed carefully for the visible eye, waiting for it to blink or turn its head to provide a better angle. Before I could squeeze the trigger, it moved with terrible, sudden speed. It charged straight toward our position, head lowered, horns leading. Tom's rifle barked again. The shot struck the side of its neck, producing a spray of that dark blood. The creature stumbled, but did not stop. Momentum and fury drove it forward. I fired and missed clean, my shot passing over its shoulder as it surged up the slope. The ground shook with each stride, and I could hear its breathing, harsh, wet, determined. Jonah dropped his shotgun, recognizing he could not reload in time, and drew the heavy knife from his belt. He positioned himself over the dogs, ready to give his life to provide them a chance to escape if the creature breached our line. Cal grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it in wide arcs, attempting to blind or drive off the charging horror. Tom stepped forward to meet the charge, demonstrating either tremendous courage or fatalistic resignation. The creature slammed into him with the force of a runaway horse. They both went down hard, Tom's rifle flying from his grip and clattering against stone. The beast snapped its jaws inches from his face, its breath hot and fetid. Tom shoved his forearm into its throat with desperate strength and reached for the knife at his belt with his free hand. He could not find the handle. Without conscious thought, I ran forward and jammed the barrel of my Henry against the creature's ribs, pressing the muzzle hard into the coarse fur. I fired point blank. The sound tore the night apart, the concussion stunning me. The beast lurched and wheezed, then thrashed in a wild burst of strength that nearly crushed me before I rolled clear. Jonah was on it then, driving his knife deep into the back of its neck, searching for the spine. Cal thrust the burning branch against its snout, and I heard flesh sizzle. The creature released a sound, part howl, part grinding roar, and went still. The sudden silence felt profoundly wrong, as though the world should not be so quiet after such violence. We stood, breathing hard, frozen in our positions for several seconds, unable to quite believe the immediate threat had ended. Tom pushed a massive body off his chest and sat up slowly, moving as though testing for broken bones. His coat was torn, deep tooth marks penetrating the fabric, but apparently not his flesh beneath. He looked at the dead creature with an expression devoid of triumph or satisfaction. He spat once into the dirt beside it. I scanned the ridge frantically for the second creature, wounded but alive somewhere in the darkness. Nothing moved. No cry echoed. No stone scraped. Just stillness and the crackling of our fire. Jonah wiped blood from his knife blade with mechanical movements. Cal sat down heavily and held his shaking hands close to the fire, staring at them as though they belonged to someone else. The mule stood farther down the slope, still alive though breathing hard and clearly traumatized. The dogs finally barked, but the sound was different now. Not fear, but anger and perhaps a sort of outrage that such things existed. Tom stood carefully and probed his ribs with cautious fingers, wincing. He announced that we were not finished until we confirmed the other creature was dead or driven far from human settlements. We would track it at first light and complete the task. Until then, we would guard the fire and hold our position. Tonight, he said with grim finality, we stay alive. I nodded my agreement and resumed my watch on the ridge, searching the darkness for movement that did not come. We remained in a tight circle around the fire throughout the night, each man facing a different cardinal direction. The dead creature lay near the protective stones, its body longer than a black bear's but built with the muscular density of a large cat. The horns curved smooth and sharp, their tips capable of puncturing flesh and bone with minimal effort. Its paws ended in claws that had actually chipped stone during its final charge. The fur was coarse to the touch and smelled powerfully of decay. Jonah scraped some dirt over its face so the eyes would not reflect our firelight. A small gesture, but it made the vigil marginally more bearable. Cal avoided looking at the corpse entirely, keeping his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our perimeter. The dogs sat pressed tightly against each other, lifting their heads periodically to scan the ridge, their ears swiveling to catch sound we could not perceive. The mule remained down the slope, turning to watch us and then the trees, clearly uncertain which direction represented safety. We kept the fire deliberately low, feeding it only thin sticks that would provide light without creating a high blaze that might destroy our night vision. Shadows danced across the grass, and every shifting pattern could potentially conceal approaching death. I checked my rifle again, though I had checked it mere minutes before. My hand still trembled slightly from the violence of the close engagement. Tom rolled his shoulder experimentally and tested his grip strength, wincing at the movement but declaring it merely bruising. He retrieved his knife, cleaned the blade with meticulous care, then set it beside him where he could reach it instantly. The night felt stretched thin, as though time itself had become elastic and unreliable. Each small sound triggered involuntary tension, a shift of dead leaves, a branch settling under frost, the low murmur of the creek somewhere below in the darkness. My mind wanted to drift toward thoughts of home, of my sister's lamp glowing welcome in the window when I returned late from the fields, but I forced such daydreams aside. Inattention would get me killed. Tom spoke quietly, almost as though thinking aloud. He observed that there had to be a reason these creatures hunted so close to human settlements. They were not starving. The one we had killed was clearly strong and well-fed, too bold for its own survival. Jonah replied that it was not boldness but territoriality. They did not want us here. We had violated their domain. Cal whispered that perhaps we had stumbled onto their trail accidentally, that we had cut through territory they guarded. Tom countered that if that were true, they had been living near human populations for months and were no longer concealing themselves. He lifted the beast's front paw, studying its construction. The hoof-like tips at the front, the heavy pads behind, something fundamentally wrong in the way it had grown, as though two different forms had been pressed together by some cruel mistake of nature. He looked up at the dark ridge again, his jaw set tight with determination. We rotated watch assignments throughout the endless night. I took the second shift. Tom, however, refused rest entirely, remaining awake through all the hours of darkness, listening to the wind and watching the shadows. During my watch, the air hung heavy with the smell of damp leaves and blood. The moon rose eventually and threw pale, cold light across the ridge, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes. I scanned every stump, every clump of grass, expecting at any moment to see those red eyes materialize. Halfway through my assigned period, a short cry echoed distant in the valley below. Not the full howl, but a truncated, pained vocalization. The second creature, wounded and suffering somewhere in the darkness. Jonah rose from his blanket before I could even turn to wake him, his instincts honed by years in the wilderness. He stated that it was hurt worse than he had initially assessed. It had moved downhill away from us. I swallowed hard, uncertain whether this development made us safer or more vulnerable. Hunting wounded animals often ended catastrophically. Injury stripped away an animal's normal caution and replaced it with desperate, unpredictable behavior. When dawn finally pushed into the hollow, our fire had reduced to nothing but ash and two faintly glowing coals. Frost crusted the grass in a thick layer, and our breath hung in the air like smoke. The dead creature's blood had dried to a black crust on its fur. The dogs accepted a small portion of food and drank water, but the mule refused grain entirely, though it managed a few mouthfuls of frost-stiff grass. Its ears flicked constantly toward every hilltop, listening for threats. Tom announced that we would not leave an injured monster roaming these slopes to potentially attack farms or travelers. He instructed Jonah to examine the body once more whilst we packed our equipment. I folded blankets and rolled my bed tight, stowing everything with practiced efficiency. Cal re-wrapped the load on the mule and tied securing knots, though his hands shook so badly he had to attempt several knots multiple times. The fight had drained his reserves more than he wanted to admit, and exhaustion was rapidly claiming him. Jonah called us over with some urgency in his voice. He had discovered something lodged near the creature's shoulder wound. A broken fragment of antler or horn, brittle and strange in texture, clearly not natural growth. The shard was light, but incredibly dense, like bone that had been compressed far beyond normal limits. The creature had been carrying this injury long before we encountered it. Tom turned the fragment in his fingers, studying it from multiple angles, then pocketed it without comment. Physical evidence might prove valuable later, though for what purpose none of us could say. We followed the blood trail left by the wounded second creature. The spoor began as scattered droplets, then thickened into smears where it had brushed against rocks or tree trunks. The path led north toward a narrow defile, cut into the ridge. The sun climbed slowly, fighting through a persistent layer of thin clouds. The woods brightened, but provided no warmth. We moved in complete silence, weapons ready, every sense alert. The dogs stayed close now, no longer pulling ahead with hunting enthusiasm. Their ears rotated constantly, monitoring sounds from all directions. Cal walked near Jonah, glancing at every fresh blood mark with visible dread. I watched the open slopes behind us as much as the trail ahead, remembering how these creatures coordinated their movements. The blood grew significantly heavier just below the defile. The smell returned with oppressive intensity, strong, sour, thick enough to taste. I covered my mouth and nose with my sleeve, but the fabric provided minimal relief. Tom raised his fist, commanding an immediate halt. He crouched to study the tracks, which had become erratic, staggering. The creature had been dragging its injured leg, creating long arcs through the accumulated leaf litter. It was slowing, weakening. Blood loss was taking its inevitable toll. Jonah whispered that the defile ahead opened into a sinkhole. He knew this ridge from deer hunting years past. The land dropped into a bowl of stone and dirt washed down by countless storms. Only one entrance, only one exit. A cornered animal with local knowledge would naturally choose such a defensible position. Tom nodded once, absorbing this tactical information. We would proceed with extreme caution till we reached the edge of the sinkhole and peered carefully down into its depths. The basin contained tangled brush and a cluster of thick cedars growing among crushed rock and poor soil. But what struck me most forcefully was the intensity of the smell. Fresh and overwhelming, stronger than anywhere we had encountered previously. The air itself seemed heavy with corruption. Tom motioned for Jonah to circle the rim to the left whilst I moved right, establishing a crossfire should the creature attempt to escape. Cal remained behind with the mule and dogs, a duty he clearly hated but understood was necessary. The mule would panic if left unattended, and the dogs might bolt after any sudden noise or movement. Jonah and I crept along opposite sides of the bowl with extreme care. The ground was treacherously loose, and each step required deliberate placement. I kept my profile low and used tree trunks as cover while scanning the bottom of the depression for any sign of movement. Initially, I saw nothing. Then I detected a dark shape behind the largest cedar, half covered by fallen branches. A leg twitched once. Involuntary muscle spasm or deliberate movement, I could not determine. I raised my rifle and steadied my sight picture, controlling my breathing. The creature's flank rose and fell rapidly, its breaths coming sharp and labored. It was dying, no question, but potentially still dangerous. Tom joined me silently, his rifle aligning with mine. He did not fire immediately. He checked Jonah's angle first, ensuring we had complete coverage before committing to the engagement. He always waited for certainty, never rushing, never allowing emotion to override tactical judgment. The creature lifted its head with obvious effort. Its eyes still burned, even in daylight, that unnatural red glow that seemed to come from within rather than being merely reflected light. It attempted to stand, but its injured leg collapsed, and it slipped back down. A low growl rattled from its throat, defiant even in extremity. It dug its claws into the dirt and pulled itself forward inch by painful inch, refusing to simply surrender to death. Tom said one word, now. 2 shots cracked as one, perfectly synchronized. The body jerked once and went utterly still. The sound died quickly in the cold air, absorbed by the surrounding forest. Jonah slid down the slope first, moving carefully on the loose scree. He prodded the corpse with his shotgun barrel, checking for any sign of life, then nodded confirmation. Dead. Completely, finally dead. Tom knelt beside it and placed his hand on its ribs, watching until he was satisfied no breath remained. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no sense of triumph, only caution and perhaps relief that the task was finished. He instructed Jonah to bring the dogs so they could learn the scent, burning it into their memory for their own future safety should anything similar ever appear again. Cal climbed down with the mule, following reluctantly behind. He stood over the dead beast for a long moment without speaking. The fear in his eyes had transformed into something harder, anger, resentment at what these creatures had made him feel during the terrible night. We stood around the corpse as wind swept down into the bowl, and I felt cold reach deeper than before. Not from weather, but from the knowledge that these things had lived here long enough to know the terrain intimately. They had established dens, routes beneath the stone, patterns of behavior. Perhaps there were more we had not encountered. Jonah pointed toward a tangle of bones near the cedar. Old kills, but not deer or goat. These bones were larger, heavier. A partially buried boot lay beside them, cracked leather and rusted nails. No bones remained inside it. Just the empty boot, a silent testament to something terrible. Tom stared at it, his jaw tightening visibly. He announced that we would burn the sinkhole, everything in it. We would not haul trophies or drag carcasses to town for gossip and speculation. Fire would cleanse this ground. The townspeople would hear truth only if they specifically needed to know. We gathered fallen branches, dry brush, and splintered cedar limbs, constructing a substantial pyre. Jonah checked the wind direction carefully. We needed the fire to burn hot, but not to spread uncontrollably across the ridge. Tom struck a match and touched it to the tinder. The flames caught slowly at first, smoking heavily, then roared to life as the fat-rich cedar would ignite it. Smoke rolled up the ridge in thick columns. Sparks climbed into the bare branches overhead like fireflies. The smell of burning fur filled the air initially, acrid and nauseating, but soon faded beneath the stronger scent of cedar pitch. We backed away as the fire spread through the accumulated brush and deadfall. The bowl lit bright with yellow and orange flames climbing the tree trunks. I watched the shape of the creature disappear beneath heat and smoke, knowing no trace would remain once winter storms washed through this depression. Tom turned to address us directly. He stated that we would return by a different route and warn the Choke and Linder families privately. They could move their livestock without creating panic in town. If people wish to laugh at precautions, let them. Better laughter than widespread fear that might cause irrational decisions. As we climbed out of the sinkhole, the fire crackled energetically below. The smoke thinned as the wind carried it eastward. We walked in silence for a long stretch, each step easing the accumulated weight from our shoulders incrementally. There was no triumph in our pace, no celebration, only relief and bone-deep exhaustion. I kept looking back, ensuring nothing followed. We were alive. Both creatures were dead. The ridge stood quiet once more, reclaimed by natural silence. We reached the first outlying farms by late afternoon, our appearance generating considerable alarm. We looked, I imagine, like men who had been through hell, torn clothing, bloodstains, hollow eyes that had seen things ordinary folk should never witness. Tom spoke privately with the Choke family and the Linders, sharing enough truth that they understood the seriousness without inciting panic. Both families agreed to move their livestock closer to their homes and maintain vigilant watches for the next several weeks. The town received a simplified version. We had tracked and killed 2 large cats that had been responsible for the livestock predation. Most people accepted this explanation without question, relieved that the immediate threat had ended. A few, like old Samuel Richardson, looked at us with knowing eyes and said nothing, understanding that some truths are too disturbing to share widely. The fragment of horn Tom had recovered remained in his possession. Occasionally, late at night when we gathered at his cabin, he would withdraw it from a drawer and turn it over in his hands, studying it by lamplight as though it might finally reveal some answer to the questions that haunted us all. What were they? Where had they come from? Were they the last of their kind? Or did others still roam the deep wilderness where humans rarely ventured? We never found satisfactory answers to these questions, and perhaps that was for the best. In the years that followed that winter of 1897, I heard occasional tales from travelers and trappers, stories of strange cries in remote hollows, of livestock killed in ways that defied normal predator behavior, of tracks that mixed characteristics of multiple species. Most dismissed these accounts as superstition or misidentification. Having seen what I saw, I was not so quick to dismiss them. Jonah Pike continued working as a tracker and guide, though he steadfastly refused any assignments that would take him into the current river backcountry. Duke and Bell, those faithful hounds who had stood with us through terror, never quite recovered their former enthusiasm for hunting. They remained good dogs, loyal and obedient, but something in their eyes had changed, a wariness that had not been present before. Calvin Turner left the Ozarks entirely within 6 months of our expedition. He moved east, I heard, to St. Louis, where the closest thing to wilderness was the city park. I did not blame him. Some men are not meant for certain experiences, and Cal had the self-awareness to recognize his limitations. There was no shame in that. Thomas Barrett remained in the hills until his death in 1912. He never spoke publicly about what we had encountered, maintaining the fiction of large cats until the end. But privately, amongst those he trusted, he would sometimes share his theory that the creatures were remnants of something ancient, perhaps survivors from time before recorded history, when different species walked the earth. He speculated that isolated populations might persist in the most remote regions, adapting, surviving, occasionally emerging to remind us that humans do not possess complete dominion over the natural world. I found his theory both compelling and deeply unsettling. As for myself, I continued hunting these hills for many years, though always with increased vigilance and never alone. I taught my sons and nephews the skills necessary to survive in the wilderness, but I also taught them respect. Respect for what they could not see, for what they did not understand, for the possibility that the world contained mysteries that science had not yet explained and perhaps never would. The winter killings ceased after our expedition. No more livestock disappeared in the night. No more strange cries echoed through the hollows. Life returned to normal, and the terror gradually faded from collective memory, replaced by more immediate concerns of farming, family, and commerce. Yet on certain winter nights, when the wind blows cold from the north and frost silvers the dead leaves, when the moon rides high and casts long shadows through the bare oaks, I sometimes stand on my porch and listen. I listen for a cry that begins low and rises high, breaking into a rough laugh before ending in a long trumpet call that echoes through the ridges. I have not heard it again. Not yet. But I remain vigilant, and I keep my rifle clean and loaded, propped beside my door where I can reach it quickly should the need arise. Because I know, we all know, those of us who were there, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The wilderness is vast, far larger than most people imagine, and it keeps its secrets well. Those who read this account in times far removed from my own, I offer this counsel. Approach the wilderness with respect and caution. The forests and mountains that remain wild are wild for good reason. They are home to creatures both known and unknown, and the boundaries between the natural and the inexplicable are far more porous than comfortable civilization would have us believe. If you venture into remote country and encounter something that defies explanation, tracks that should not exist, sounds that match no known animal, eyes that reflect red in the darkness, do not dismiss your observations as imagination or superstition. Trust your instincts. They exist for good reason, honed by millions of years of evolution to keep you alive. Do not go alone into places that feel wrong. Do not ignore the warnings of local residents who have lived alongside the wilderness for generations. Their folklore and legends often contain kernels of truth wrapped in metaphor and embellishment. And if you should encounter something like what we faced in that winter of 1897, something that moves wrong, sounds wrong, smells wrong, do not attempt to engage it out of curiosity or bravado. Retreat to safety, gather others, and approach the situation with overwhelming force and caution. The creatures we killed were intelligent, coordinated, and possessed of strength far beyond their size should have granted. They were apex predators in terrain they knew intimately. We survived through a combination of luck, preparation, and the fact that there were only 2 of them. Had there been more, had they been less injured by our initial encounters, the outcome might have been very different. I do not share this account to frighten or sensationalize, but rather to document what occurred and to offer whatever small wisdom might be gleaned from our experience. The world is stranger than we imagine, and sometimes, just sometimes, the old stories contain more truth than modern education would have us believe. There exists in the Ozark Highlands, and perhaps in other remote wilderness areas across this vast continent, something that defies easy categorization. Local peoples have given it various names over the centuries, the Ozark Howler being merely one of many appellations. Descriptions vary, but common elements persist. A creature bearing horns, possessing great strength, moving with unnatural stealth, and producing a cry that freezes the blood of those who hear it. Skeptics will dismiss such accounts as misidentification, hysteria, or deliberate fabrication. They will produce rational explanations involving known animals behaving in unusual ways. They will point to the absence of physical specimens or photographic evidence as proof that such creatures cannot exist. I cannot argue with their logic, for logic is a powerful tool that has served humanity well. But I can offer my testimony as a man who saw, who fought, who killed something that should not have existed according to the comfortable certainties of natural science. We brought back no trophies, no physical proof beyond the fragment Tom kept private. We burned the bodies and scattered the ashes, driven by instinct we could not quite articulate. A sense that some things should not be studied, should not be displayed, should not be permitted to enter the realm of human knowledge and commerce. Perhaps we were wrong to do so. Perhaps scientists could have learned valuable information from those corpses. But I do not regret our decision. Some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The Ozark Howler, if indeed that is what we encountered, may still exist in the deepest hollows and most remote ridges. Or perhaps we killed the last of their kind, and they are now as extinct as the passenger pigeon or the eastern elk. I do not know, and I suspect I never will. What I do know is this: the wilderness is not entirely tamed, not entirely known, not entirely safe. It harbors wonders and terrors in equal measure, and those who venture into its depths should do so with eyes open and minds prepared for the impossible. This is my account, set down truthfully and completely as memory permits. I have neither embellished for dramatic effect, nor minimized for the comfort of skeptical readers. This is what happened in the winter of 1897 in the current river country of the Ozark Highlands, when 4 men went hunting for a cattle killer and found something far more terrible than they had imagined. May God grant that you never face what we faced. But if you should, may this account provide some small guidance that might preserve your life. In the interest of completeness, I should note that I consulted several naturalists and zoologists in the years following our expedition, describing what we encountered in careful detail, whilst withholding the more extraordinary elements that would have invited immediate dismissal. Their consensus was that we had most likely encountered aberrant specimens of known species, perhaps mountain lions affected by some developmental abnormality, or bears exhibiting unusual morphological characteristics due to genetic mutation or environmental factors. The horn-like protrusions could have been bony growths resulting from injury or disease. The unusual vocalizations might have been individual variations within normal species ranges. These explanations possess the virtue of fitting within established scientific frameworks, and I did not argue strenuously against them. Who was I, after all, but an unschooled hunter from the backcountry, to contradict men who had studied at universities and published learned papers? Yet I noted that none of these educated gentlemen volunteered to accompany me back into those hills to search for additional specimens or to verify their hypotheses through direct observation. Their certainty extended precisely to the boundaries of their comfortable offices and laboratories, and not one step beyond. I mention this not to disparage scientific inquiry, which I hold in high regard, but rather to note that science, like all human endeavors, possesses limitations. It excels at explaining the known, but struggles with the truly anomalous. It can describe what is, but sometimes fails to acknowledge what might be. The creatures we encountered may have been aberrant specimens of known species. They may have been representatives of an undiscovered or thought-extinct species. They may have been something else entirely, something that defies the neat categories into which we attempt to organize the natural world. I leave it to wiser minds than mine to determine the truth. I merely recount what I experienced, what I saw, what I fought, and what I killed in those frozen January days of 1897. As I write these words in the autumn of 1923, nearly 3 decades have passed since that winter expedition. I am an old man now, my hands gnarled with arthritis, my eyes requiring spectacles for any close work, my hair long since gone white. The vigor that carried me through those January hills has faded, replaced by the aches and limitations of advancing age. Memory, I have learned, is an imperfect instrument. It smooths some details and sharpens others according to its own mysterious logic. I have endeavored throughout this account to separate clear recollection from speculation, fact from interpretation, what I observed directly from what I inferred or was told by others. Yet I acknowledge the possibility of error. Perhaps fear magnified certain details beyond their objective reality. Perhaps exhaustion and cold affected our perceptions during that long night. Perhaps what we encountered, while certainly dangerous and unusual, was not quite as extraordinary as I have portrayed it. I can only offer what I remember, filtered through the limitations of human observation and the distortions of time. I have consulted with Jonah Pike in the preparation of this account, and our recollections align on all major points, though we differ on some specifics. Tom Barrett, unfortunately, passed before I began this written record, so I could not verify details with him. The physical evidence is long since destroyed, burned in that sinkhole, reduced to ash and scattered by wind and weather. The fragment Tom kept has disappeared, either lost or disposed of after his death. We have no specimens, no photographs, no proof beyond the words of aging men whose testimony would be easily dismissed by skeptics. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some experiences are meant to be preserved only in memory and story, passed along as warnings or wonders, believed or dismissed according to each listener's temperament and philosophy. I set down this account not to convince the skeptical, but to document what occurred for those who might benefit from the knowledge. If you believe it, use it as a caution should you venture into remote wilderness. If you dismiss it as the fabrication of a superstitious backwoods man or the confused recollections of an old man, so be it. I will not be here to argue the point much longer, but I will say this in conclusion. I have lived a long life, seen much, experienced both the ordinary and the extraordinary. I have learned to distinguish reality from imagination, fact from fancy. What we encountered in the current river country that winter was real. It was dangerous. It was unlike anything in my previous experience or subsequent life. The Ozark Howler exists or existed. Of that, I remain absolutely certain. Whether it continues to roam those remote ridges, I cannot say. But I hope, for the sake of those who now live in those hills, for the sake of unwary travelers and curious hunters, I hope that if any of its kind survive, they remain hidden in the deepest wilderness, far from human habitation, content to live and die in obscurity. The world has room for mysteries. Not everything needs to be cataloged, classified, and controlled. Some things are better left alone, unknown, unexplained. This is my final testimony, set down in the year of our Lord 1923, by my hand, sworn to be true and accurate to the best of my recollection and understanding. May God grant peace to Thomas Barrett, who led us through those terrible days with courage and wisdom. May he grant comfort to Calvin Turner, wherever he may be, who faced his fears and survived. May he grant continued health to Jonah Pike, my companion through decades of hunting and the only other living soul who fully understands what we faced. And may he grant protection to all who venture into the wild places of this earth. For the wilderness is beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and it keeps its secrets well. Authenticated account. Written and sworn by. Name withheld for privacy. Current River Country, Missouri. November 1923.